and
There was an
bribers.
attack on the temple of the Moscow Society.
Football
for
fans
Krishna
attacked
Barnaul,
the
there was an
Krishna temple
attempted
in
attack
Moscow.
on Krishna
Skinheads attacked
worshippers.
Krishna worshippers were beaten in
Yaroslavl.
Moscow.
Krishna devotee was beaten.
Scientology is one of the most dangerous totalitarian sects, and Scientology surpasses many cults in its destructiveness. I've seen many ex-Scientologists who were absolutely just severely mentally ill. I'll repeat again, cults are very aggressive and very deceitful. With the mentality of a slave and the mentality of a whistleblower. He works for intelligence services. He's been gathering information since he was a child. I mean, he brings money, he brings information. If you're in Scientology, when you finally run out of everything, when you run out of money and your mental health or physical health, they will get rid of you. They will throw you out on the street and forget about you.
FSB released video of searches at Scientology centers.
Searches in Moscow in connection with the case of
Scientologists
Scientology.
Court sentenced 5 Scientologists.
White Scientologists are
Scientology
persecuted in
organizations
Russia.
have been declared undesirable.
Among neo-Pentecostals, there is a tithe, but again, no one counts it. Yet, there is such an ordinary elementary principle of extortion. It's an alternative version of Christianity created by the enemy of the human race, which is called Christianity, and from which the entire essence of Christianity has been hollowed out. Neo-Pentecostals are 300,000 plus activists who will go where they are told and do what they are ordered to do. This is not a figure of
Attack on the
speech.
Pentecostal
Oman
church
attacked
in
Pentecostals.
Searches conducted at the homes of leaders of the new generation of
Residents
Pentecostals.
disrupted a Pentecostal worship service.
Charge. Thus, public activities of the ringleader of the Russian anti-cult clique, Alexander Dvorkin, exhibit signs of crimes associated with terrorist activities. Hostile statements that create an atmosphere of intolerance, resulting in verbal abuse, threats, and physical attacks on people, as well as attacks on buildings, including arson. This is incitement to commit terrorist acts that spread hatred and endanger lives. It also hinders the enjoyment of human rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security. Therefore, according to the definition in the UN General Assembly resolution adopted on June 22, 2023, this activity constitutes terrorism.
An aggravating circumstance is Dvorkin's deliberate use of special hidden manipulative methods and technologies aimed at covert influence, programming, and control of human behavior. Their use is directly evidenced by the fact that his public activities provoked a wave of violence among the population towards stigmatized victims, including physical violence against them, up to murders. These manipulative technologies operate bypassing critical perception through consciousness and directly affecting a person's deep subconsciousness. It is exactly the destructive mindsets and commands implanted into people's subconsciousness without their knowledge that force people to subsequently commit acts of violence and hatred against targeted individuals, chosen not by themselves, but by Dvorkin. He has artificially incited a wave of hatred and negativity in people and forced them to act. In a literal sense, Dvorkin has directed those individuals, like torpedoes, against their will and desire towards his chosen targets. Therefore, all those individuals who committed acts of aggression against other people who are just like them, but marked by anti-cultists with a yellow star, are also victims of informational terror attacks. Dvorkin had programmed them for those actions in advance at the level of subconsciousness when he used manipulative technologies in his speeches. They were literally forced to act this way, and unknowingly, by attacking innocent people, they were enacting someone else's malicious will. This is why Dvorkin's speeches had such a powerful effect on people, although in the overwhelming majority of cases, evidence for his accusatory speeches was not presented. The mere utterance of these labels was enough to provoke an explosive reaction in society and a wave of brutality against the labeled groups.
The use of these hidden manipulative technologies within the anti-cult movement was first introduced by Alexander Dvorkin. This has since become a common practice for creating informational terror attacks by all anti-cult organizations, including Ratsirs and Fekris. These very methods enable anti-cults to influence people against their will. Moreover, it doesn't matter if this happens directly through personal contact or remotely through media messages. The power of influence remains unchanged. More details about the technology itself, as well as about the source where Dvorkin received it from, will be provided a little later.
Representatives of anti-cult organizations use foul techniques of manipulative psychological influence on the masses to carry out real acts of terrorism. Until recently, it was believed that informational and psychological terror attacks were not as frightening as physical ones because they supposedly did not kill anyone directly like a bomb explosion would. But in reality, informational terror attacks are much more dangerous and destructive, most of all because they are conducted covertly, operating at the subconscious level, easily penetrating the critical thinking barrier of the conscious mind and infecting people with destructive beliefs, thereby creating new terrorists. The impact radius of such attacks is much larger than physical ones because by acting through the informational space, they are not limited by space or time. The most terrifying aspect of this situation is that for a very long time, up to today, a vast number of real terrorists have remained unpunished. However, while their methods of influencing the depths of the subconscious can go unnoticed by the masses, the demonization and groundless accusations of groups of people stigmatized by representatives of anti-cult organizations and systematic violation of the presumption of innocence are always in full sight. Even by this one factor alone, they can now be easily identified and held accountable to the fullest extent of the law for their complicity in and perpetration of terrorism.
Anti-cultists' influence on law enforcement agencies.
Public activities of anti-cultists are merely a preparatory stage for further involving law enforcement and security forces in suppressing religious groups. For this purpose, under the guise of educational work, members of anti-cult organizations deliver lectures and arrange consultations for law enforcement agencies, including police academies and security management, where they continue to propagate the same messages that cult members are a threat to society.
Anti-cultist Alexander Dvorkin gave a lesson to students in Chelyabinsk.
Cults lure people in through deception, withholding information, and dishonest advertising. Cults are dangerous to individuals because they enslave personality and turn a human into an obedient tool in the hands of cult leaders.
Such activities are not only unacceptable, but also dangerous, as they aim to instill radical ideology in the minds of security officials, which can have far-reaching consequences for society and the state as a whole.
Several eyewitness stories will help illustrate the seriousness of the problem and serve as examples of what terrorist anti-cult propaganda is capable of in the modern, civilized 21st century. First-person account from Andrei in Belgorod. Requested anonymity.
There were actions taken against us. For example, in the fall of 2012, we held a congress. The area was cordoned off by Cossacks with whips. They beat drums, invited the NTV television company and local media, and portrayed our activities in a negative light. They shouted at us, "We'll throw a grenade at you," and the police did not react at all. At some of the actions against Jehovah's Witnesses, they wore T-shirts that said, "I hate Jehovah's Witnesses." I was directly threatened. "Aren't you afraid you'll get hit on the head and be disabled for life?" Given what I've witnessed since around 2010, I believe it will only worsen.
My dear ones, please, if you carry your faith, carry it with peace and kindness. We've never stabbed anyone, and we're not going to stab anyone.
In 2014, an elderly fellow believer was killed in Stary Oskol. She was on her way to a meeting, got into an elevator, and was found with multiple stab wounds, and her eyes gouged out. The local media wrote that she was a member of one of the cults, which is how they often refer to us. The perpetrators were never found. Our sister was beaten in her own apartment building by a man who then dragged her around the building. Funeral wreaths with inscriptions "To victims of the Watchtower" were placed at our Kingdom Hall in Belgorod, and swastikas were painted on the building's walls. I believe that the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses is orchestrated by the FSB. In their view, Jehovah's Witnesses do not fit into the political framework of today's Russia. The 5th Directorate of the KGB used to persecute dissenters. Today, it is the Directorate for the Protection of the Constitutional Order of the FSB. This is the political police. Jehovah's Witnesses refuse military service and do not support any political forces, which does not align with the ideology of modern Russia. I think the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC, plays the role assigned to it by the FSB. If we look at the history of the ROC as it exists today, it was created by Stalin's order in 1943. Since then, this religious organization has been a structural subdivision of the State Security Committee, which is now the FSB of Russia. Experienced police officers have told me that they don't understand why they are being forced to persecute people for their religion. One even said that under the current government, it has become embarrassing to work in the police force because they are detaining elderly women for talking about the Bible, apprehending people on the street for unclear reasons, breaking into apartments, and so on. What is happening to Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia today can happen to anyone, to any political or religious movement, such as Baptists, Pentecostals, or the autonomous Russian Orthodox Church. They are already under pressure and are at risk. The broad definitions of anti-extremist laws allow for the persecution of anyone. We know that people can be imprisoned for reposting something on the internet or for making a simple statement deemed extremist, using the law to force this into the so-called legal framework.
In 2017, due to lobbying by Dvorkin and members of his group, Jehovah's Witnesses were declared an extremist organization, and their activities were banned in Russia. From that moment, the repression against them intensified and continues to this day. Members of this religious organization face arrests, searches, and prosecutions, as well as cruel treatment and even torture. Some of them, including elderly people and retirees, have been sentenced to long terms in penal colonies and imprisonment for their beliefs and religious activities.
The editorial collegium of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation has determined the decision of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation dated April 20th, 2017 remains unchanged, and the appellate complaint of the religious organization Administrative Center of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia is dismissed.
Freedom of conscience in Russia has been crucified. There is no doubt that what happened to Jehovah's Witnesses will affect other denominations as well. A little bit later, religious persecutions will begin in Russia. There will be prisoners of conscience. The very term cult is certainly used as a stigma, as a label intended to turn people away from Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as from other organizations that are also labeled as cults by anti-cult activists or other opponents. If we assess the contribution of the anti-cult movement to the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe it plays an overwhelmingly negative role and largely contributes to the expansion of persecutions against peaceful believers who simply seek to satisfy their religious needs, guaranteed by the Constitution of the Russian Federation. The right to satisfy their religious needs, including the right to collectively profess their religion. Believers are already facing persecution, attacks, and physical violence in places where meetings and gatherings used to take place. They are subjected to acts of vandalism. We fear that this will become widespread. People who are guilty of nothing other than adhering to certain religious beliefs will find themselves targeted by those who consider them enemies of society.
As for liquidation of the Jehovah's Witnesses organization, in this regard, I have no disagreement with it. The ban on the organization is undoubtedly helpful. Primarily, we no longer see Jehovah's Witnesses in the streets, and consequently, people are protected from their intrusive propaganda and recruitment. When we talk about Jehovah's Witnesses, I certainly hope that their ordinary members will at least receive administrative penalties, but I understand that I'm not a lawyer and the law is the law.